Will the future of Western civilization be determined by its connection to Israel? And why could only a return to the Bible and the Jewish foundations that built the West save it from collapsing? Hello, everyone. I'm Matan Hasidim from Jerusalem, and welcome to my podcast, Spirit of the Times. Today, I have the privilege of speaking with someone who has written a book on exactly these topics, Josh Hammer. Hammer is a senior editor at Newsweek, syndicated columnist, podcaster, and research fellow at the Edmund Burke Foundation, and today is considered one of the leading voices in American conservatism. We are here to talk today about Josh's new book, Israel and Civilization: The Fate of the Jewish Nation and the Destiny of the West. Hello, Josh.
Thank you so much for having me. It's really a pleasure to make your acquaintance, and I'm delighted to talk about the book with you.
Wow, thank you very much. So before we dive into your book, could you briefly introduce yourself, especially for the
Sure.
Israeli audience who may be not be familiar with your work?
Sure. I am an American, but I'm a proud American Jew. I've been very active in U.S.-Israel relations and pro-Israel advocacy, among other things that I've done over the course of my professional career. You mentioned the Emmy Burke Foundation. That's headed by Jerusalem's own Yoram Hazony, who is a dear friend of mine. He provided a very gracious blurb for this book, Israel and Civilization. I wear a lot of hats professionally here. I work for Newsweek as senior editor at large. I write a weekly syndicated opinion column that gets put in a lot of newspapers and publications. I host two shows, two podcasts, one of which is also on radio. And I've generally written a lot of things over the years, Matam, but the one thing that I have not written until now is a book. So I'm very excited for my first book, and it's a topic near and dear to my heart. It's funny, before we dive in here, I was actually planning on writing a totally unrelated book. I was actually talking with my literary agent to write an entirely unrelated book, kind of like a young conservative manifesto type thing. And then October 7th happened, and I decided to switch course. That this moment was bigger than me in my professional career. That this moment is fundamentally a time that Jews are going to have to start coming out, not just with their rifles, as all the heroic members of Chaylim Zahal are doing on a day-to-day basis, but with the pen as well, and to just defend that which has made our civilization great, and frankly, in many ways, just to defend the Jewish people and Judaism itself, frankly.
Wow. So, okay, let's talk about the main thesis of your new book. In other words, why does the West needs Judaism and Israel?
So Western civilization, what is it? I mean, this is a question that I take on head on the book there. I mean, chapter one of the book begins with kind of just setting the scene. I talk about my trip to Treblinka, the Nazi concentration camp years ago, and then my trip to Kfar Aza in the aftermath of October 7th. Then I talk about the horrific things on American university campuses. But the real meat
I
of the
think you
book
even
then be
write that behind you, like you have something from Treblinka, right, in your office always.
right here. It's a rock from Treblinka next to me.
Wow.
And this is from the crematorium of Auschwitz, actually.
Wow.
So, so yes, I keep these on my desk at all times, just to kind of remind me and ground me there. So I think about these things every single day. But that was chapter one of the book, was setting the scene. Chapter two of the book is really kind of diving in earnest. And the argument of the book, Matan, fundamentally, is that we hear oftentimes in commentary circles and political discourse, we're at a civilizational inflection point. Yeah, we're at a crossroads here. We can go one of multiple directions there. But I'm actually a lawyer by professional background. I went to law school. I clerked for a federal judge. I actually still speak on law school campuses to this day. And I like to define terms. So let's define a term here. What is the West? You want to say the West is at an inflection point? Well, what does that mean? Well, the West is the Bible. The West is the Judeo Christian moral, ethical, legal, and political tradition. Growing up, I think a lot of people thought of the West as having its origins in Greco-Roman thoughts, in with Socrates and Aristotle, Cicero. I'm not downplaying the importance.
Yeah, well, I think,
Uh,
a scholar like Leo Strauss maybe called Athens and
yes,
Jerusalem as the two pillars of the West. So, some might argue that you've overlooked maybe ancient Greece as a key foundation of the West.
right. So Leo Strauss famously did argue that Western civilization is kind of this double helix, this kind of DNA like strand of reason and revelation. I'm not downplaying reason. What I am saying is that without something else, reason is counterproductive, bordering on potentially catastrophic, unless you are tethering reason to something. Unless you have an exogenous worldview, a predetermined worldview, and then you use reason as an analytical tool within that structure. This, for instance, is how the Rambam. This is how Maimonides talks about using reason there in his Guide for the Perplexed. There, 700-800 years ago or whatnot. There, he talks about how reason can be important there, and that actually was what was quite challenging to a lot of Jewish sages at that time. Actually, how the Rambam came out in favor of reason there, but he contextualized it. He said that reason. We're not talking here about unaided reason, about just kind of sitting in a room. There's a philosopher, John Rawls, who talks about the veil of ignorance. Rambam is not saying we go to this Rawlsian veil of ignorance and just close our eyes and say, oh, reason. No, no, reason can be used within a construct. Well, what is that construct? The construct is the Bible. And the fundamental argument in my book is that everything that we call the West today begins with God's world altering revelation to Moses and the Israelites assembled there at Mount Sinai. We overlook so much of it, but that really is where so much of it comes from, whether it's the English common law tradition, whether it's the American founding there. And fundamentally, Matan, Jews and Christians alike need to look back to the origins of our civilization if we are going to kind of muster the fortitude, the courage, and the skill to ward off the very real and very serious threats that we face today. We have to double down on where we come from in order to have the gravitas, the heft, and indeed the capacity to then ultimately dictate our future course over these next hundreds, God willing, thousands and beyond of years.
Okay, great. So, can you give an example of like an important Jewish influence on Western history or Western philosophy that is still relevant today for the West's survival?
Sure. So there's obviously there's a million
Yeah,
examples,
it's a very
but
big question, but
yeah, but I mean, just one very obvious one. So throughout the book, I argue that Genesis 1:27, Sefer Bereshit, this is kind of the single foundational ethical moral imperative for all of Western civilization. So in Hebrew, we would say B'Tselem Elohim. For our Catholic friends, Imago Dei. That's the notion that God made man in His own image, male and female. He created them, and to me, the entire basis of genuine moral human equality under law in law and politics can be traced to Genesis 1:27 there. So for instance, here I'm an American, obviously. So July 4th every year is our American Independence Day, and I'm an American patriot. We love reading the Declaration of Independence that Thomas Jefferson wrote in Philadelphia in 1776. We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by the Creator with certain inalienable rights. Among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. He was mirroring the language very similarly to John Locke, writing his second treatise in England about a century or so prior there. But the relevant question, Matan, are Jefferson and Locke actually just making this up in a vacuum? Or, much kind of like the Rambam writing centuries prior, this is using reason within a pre-existing worldview there. Well, they're obviously getting this from somewhere. They're getting it from Genesis 1:27. So many other examples. I mean, in the book, I talk about how, so I was raised quite secular. I've only become religious over the past couple of years or so. And, when I went to public school growing up in kindergarten, the big thing I was taught was the golden rule. Treat others as you like to be treated, right? This is kind of in America, at least we call that the so-called golden rule. Well, where does that come from? Sefer Vayikra. It's right there in the book of Leviticus there. Treat your fellow as yourself. I mean, if you want to go back to the Talmud, actually, that is what Hillel famously says is actually the overarching theme of the entire Torah. There's a famous story in the Talmud of the curious Gentile who is seeking to convert to Judaism, based on whether Hillel or Shammai can explain the entirety of Torah while standing on one foot. Shammai famously dismisses him. Hillel says, okay, it's treat others as you would like to be treated. The rest is basically just support for that proposition. Go and study it. So, I mean, so many of these things, they all have their source in the Hebrew scripture there. So it really is incumbent on us Jews to be lights unto the nation, to really double down on our own heritage. And God willing, our Christian friends will do the exact same as well.
So the question, so it's really interesting, but maybe the question still remains that if I have those principles from John Locke and Thomas Jefferson, why should I need the revelation? Why should I need Sinai? Maybe Jewish contribution is maybe very important to learn the history of the West, but why it's relevant today for the West to survive? That's what actually I think you suggest in your book, right?
All right, so there's two possible answers that come to mind here. So the first is I will just kind of elaborate from my perspective on the perils and pitfalls of unaided reason, of just trying to use reason without tethering it also to revelation. The problem, quite simply, is that some of the most brutal, horrific atrocities in human history have been done in the name of unaided reason. I was just showing the viewers here these rocks from Treblinka and Auschwitz. Well, the perpetrators of those very atrocities thought that they were acting according to reason. They thought that they were acting in a reasonable and rational fashion there, according to the prevailing eugenicist doctrines and dogmas of the day. Lebensraum and all these other German words are. They thought that this was all rational and reasonable. There's a lot of other examples in history, but things can go off the
From
rails
18th century,
very.
from the Enlightenment and French Revolution to communism.
Yes.
Yeah.
The French Revolution is a brilliant example as well. We know from Edmund Burke writing in his reflections on the revolution in France, of course, that this is one of the quintessential examples of kind of using so-called unaided reason to just burn it all down and to throw it all down and to burn down your tradition there. Interestingly, Matan, I think it's worth noting that the reason that Burke was so much more sympathetic towards the American Revolution rather than the French Revolution was because he viewed the American Revolution as a fundamentally conservative endeavor insofar as they were seeking to recover the civil rights that the Englishmen had under the Civil Rights Act or the English Bill of Rights of the late 17th century there that the King George had illegally infringed actually upon the colonists. But I digress, alas. The point here is that unaided reason can very quickly lead us to a very, very, very bad place. The corollary to that, and the other reason that I think that the Bible and this argument that flows from really from nothing less than the divine revelation at Mount Sinai. The reason this is important is because nature abhors a vacuum. We know that from physics. And moral and political argumentation also abhors a vacuum. When you have an interlocutor, when you have a rhetorical or political or substantive foe that is coming at you with an argument, it might strike you as immoral, but if they're making it on moral terminology there, you have to have a fundamentally moral argument to push back upon there. You can't have a values neutral or kind of just utterly dispassionate argument. Pure proceduralism, in short, or simply kind of resorting to saying just use reason is not going to work. You're going to have a cogent, moral, compelling argument there. So when you look at some of the forces seeking to overthrow Western civilization, and in the book I identify three leading causes. There is in no particular order. There is wokeism, there is Islamism, and there is global neoliberalism. When you look at these three forces there, and then you look at the West, as I have defined it there, as really being largely synonymous with the Judeo-Christian and biblical heritage there. Well, what is the obvious moral substantive counter to turn back the tide on this neo-Marxist wokeism, on this Sharia supremacist Islamism, and on this homogenizing global neoliberalism? Well, it's a double down on the Bible because it's actually all in there, right? So you actually need something substantive to stand on in order to ward back. And I cannot think of anything that is better suited than the very substance that founded this entire civilization in the first place.
One of your most interesting arguments in the book I found was about that Jewish ethics rooted in halakha. Halakha is the Jewish code. Um, Offer a more balanced approach to the individual collective relationship compared to systems like liberalism, socialism, or hedonistic secularism. Can you explain maybe a little bit of that?
So we live in interesting political times, and here in the United States, conservatism, the Republican Party, have been in kind of a state of flux for a long time now, right? Especially in the aftermath of Donald Trump and the 2016 presidential election there. And I think a lot of conservatives have been grappling for a long time with this question of how to be clear, this is not a new question. This is a question that goes back as old as politics, as old as the Bible, as the case may be, of how to reconcile individual dignity with this notion of the common good. Frankly, a lot of people here in the United States, even on the purported nominal rights, had gone far too down the rabbit hole for decades and decades of exalting individualism at the expense of any notion of the union, of the general welfare, of the common good. But if you go back and you look at what the Hebrew Bible, the Talmud, what halakha, what it actually says about these matters, there is so much in there that can indeed should be a template for how we think about these very matters today. So just a couple of examples that come to mind. One is, I was thinking recently about in the book of Exodus, Sefer Shemot. Think about the revolution at Har Sinai. So God Hashem is holding the mountain over Moses and the Israelites descended down below. And he basically says, if you accept my covenant, then I will make you a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. Well, he's not saying I will make each and every one of you individually holy. You're going to be a kingdom of priests, a holy nation there. He's talking here about this idea of the collective there. Similarly in the book of Leviticus, Sefer Vayikra, when Hashem says you shall be holy because the Lord your God is holy there. Again, it's this collective view. And all throughout the Talmud, all throughout Gemara, you see this play out time and time again. It's actually right there in Tractate Shabbat. How I don't have the exact line memorized verbatim, but you see here that basically if there is a moral sin that is going to be done in your community and you individually have the power to stop it and you do not act, then you will be held responsible for the sin of the community. And taken to its logical conclusion, the famous line in Gemara is that if an individual has the power to stop a sin on behalf of the entire world and he fails to stop it, he will be held accountable on behalf for the sins of the entire world. That is very, very different reconciliation of individual dignity with the common good than, for instance, John Stuart Mill, the Enlightenment thinker, with his well-known so-called harm theory, which essentially says that if I don't punch you in the face, I don't physically harm you, it's not my business there. So, go in your house and, use your drugs,
Let
whatever,
them
do
let
your
live. Yeah.
prostitution.
Yeah.
Yeah, this is Enlightenment liberalism, right?
Mm.
On the other hand, I don't want to overstate my case. So halakha, Judaism is also obviously very big on individual moral dignity. This is the entire point of Genesis 1:27, what we were talking about earlier, this notion that we all have a spark of the divine because we are made in God's image there. We all have that really for our lives. And furthermore, even when it comes to kind of economic debates, you can't take the common good aspect too far. So, for instance, socialism or Marxism would be completely verboten. It would violate at least two of the 10 commandments. Thou shalt not steal, thou shalt not covet. So, but the point, Matan, is that this is a genuine reconciliation process, the likes of which I think many conservatives in the West are doing at this very moment there. And we could stand to learn a lot from the Jewish tradition in this respect.
Okay, so a little bit about maybe the biblical prophets and Israel. Do you think the acceptance of your ideas is connected to the expectation that many in the West would see again Israel as some kind of the fulfillment of a biblical prophecy, something like that?
Yes, maybe, but I don't think it necessarily hinges on that either. I mean, you live in Israel. You're obviously familiar with the different types of Orthodox Jews, of religious Jews. You have some in the Dati Leomi camp who do believe in modern Israel as having theological or biblical significance. Then, of course, you have many Haredim who do not think that. My brother-in-law, actually, who lives in Israel, who lives in Netivot, is Haredi, and he definitely does not think that the current state of Israel has theological significance. I am closer to Dati Leomi in my own personal worldview, and I am inclined to think that the current state of Israel does have messianic and biblical significance there. And to be clear, that's in the book as well. I do talk about the end of the book of Deuteronomy, Sefer Devarim. It seems to me like a lot of what God says at the end of the Torah, at the end of the book of Deuteronomy, has basically come true. In fact, literally in our morning prayers every morning, actually, we see it there. There are various quotes from the book of Deuteronomy. You shall be scattered at the ends of the world. You shall be brought back in together there. I mean, it seems to me that a lot of these things actually are coming true. Now we live also in very interesting times from a Christian perspective on this particular issue. So, for instance, Mike Huckabee, who is the incoming ambassador to Israel, is not yet confirmed, but God willing, he will be sooner rather than later. He's an ordained Baptist minister back in his home state in the United States of Arkansas. He's been very outspoken that he genuinely believes in Genesis chapter 12, verse 3, that God shall bless those who bless the children of Israel, and he shall curse those who curse the children of Israel. I happen to believe that Mike Huckabee is on firm ground for that, not just because it's the word of God that says so, because history plays this out. I can't think of a single instance. I literally cannot think of a single instance in human history where a society that has cursed or oppressed or discriminated against the Jews and has been better off because of that. Anti-Semitism, hatred of Jews is here, there, and everywhere, symptomatic of a broader societal, cultural, and civilizational rot. It is never about the Jews. It is always indicative of a broader illness and disease that is happening in a society at a given moment there. And I think that our Christian friends are on very solid ground for taking out that stance as well. So look, there's a lot of different audiences for this particular book. I grew up secular, as I mentioned there, so I very much would like some of my fellow Jews, the kind of folks who I grew up with, who did not do the mitzvot, who had a somewhat ethereal, detached connection to Judaism. I would love for them to read this book and to be inspired to try to embrace your tradition and be a light unto the nations. I also care deeply, deeply about Christian readers. I sincerely hope that so many Christian friends read this book there. The current polling in the United States at this moment shows that the younger generation of Christians are not as over the top enthusiastic about both the Jewish people and the Jewish state as the older generation. To me, that is a potentially dangerous sign. We see that playing out right now when it comes to some higher profile podcasters who are saying a lot of garbage, frankly. And I really, really hope that Christians fall in love with what made their own civilization great, which oftentimes really is predicated again in the Hebrew scriptures and the philosophy of the Hebrew Bible itself.
Well, I'm just on it with you about the state of Israel and the prophecies. And by the way, really interesting point. I must point out that in the theological discourse, taking place in the West about religion and faith, this argument for the existence of God hardly ever comes up. It's really interesting. I've never heard it, and I've always thought to myself, well, it's so simple, like how people won't use it. So your book really speaks in a Jewish language, as you said, citing the Talmud, Midrash, Bible, using Hebrew terms. You write neshama in Hebrew, soul. So do you think it's time for Jews to teach the principles of Judaism to non-Jews? Like, is it necessary?
I do think it's necessary. Um, Look, we're called to be a light into the nations, and that has a lot of meanings. I mean, most clearly, it means to try our best to actually fulfill the terms of the reciprocal two-way covenant with God by making him king, by fulfilling the mitzvot. So that's the clearest and most explicit way that we're called to be a light unto the nations. But we're also called to be a light unto the nations in kind of a slightly more abstract way, because Western civilization starts with the Jews. As I have defined Western civilization, it literally starts with the Jews. And you have, the technical mitzvot aside, you have kind of an overarching ethical obligation, I would argue. If you are a Jew who cares about Western civilization, you care more broadly about the entire tradition that our people have given the world, going all the way back to Moses receiving the word, passing it on to Joshua. That's chapter 1, verse 1 of Pirkei Avot is how the tradition transcends there. You have an obligation to do that there. And look, Judaism is not an evangelist creed, unlike Christianity. I mean, I'm not saying that Jews should go about trying actively to convince or to persuade non-Jews to convert or anything. That's obviously not the Jewish approach towards these matters there. But we do have an obligation to explain what our tradition is and what our religion is at a time, especially when that religion is under such siege. And it is under siege. It's under siege every which way you look. Obviously, in a transnational space, when it comes to the United Nations and all the garbage that they say about the modern state of Israel there, it's under siege as well in the online space. Tragically, I can't log on to social media on a given day without seeing a veritable deluge of some of the most violent anti-Semitism that you can probably imagine. It's quite bad out there, actually, in many ways, and only the truth can prevail over these lies and falses. So we absolutely, in order to turn back the tide, simply just sitting back and taking it, that's never worked out particularly well. The
Yes.
second to last chapter of the book is called the Maccabean Imperative. It's trying to encourage fellow Jews to take up the mantle of the Maccabees. So Maccabee is actually my Hebrew name because Hammer Maccabee. So I'm big on the whole Maccabee thing. Hanukkah is one of my favorite holidays when not there. The Maccabees didn't just sit there and take it. They actually took up arms and they defended. They defended the religion against the assimilationists and against the would-be conquerors of Jerusalem and the Holy Land. So similarly today, the imperative is for the Jewish people to be modern Maccabees. And again, fulfilling the mitzvot, fulfilling the commandments is part of the equation. It absolutely should be, but it's not the entirety of it too. So even for those Jews who grew up very secular, cannot quite bring themselves to fulfill all the mitzvot at the barest of bare minimum, you have to be a capable of defending and explaining your religion and your inherited way of life in today's current morass that we are dealing with out there.
Okay, so you spoke about the importance of Christian-Jewish alliance in the fight against Islamism and woke culture and neoliberalism. I must say that in Israel, many rabbis, even people that would consider themselves conservatives, would be uncomfortable with this idea, even with the term Judeo-Christian tradition. Given maybe the trauma of anti-Semitism rooted in Christianity, given the very different religions that Christianity and Judaism are. It's Yoram Chazoni told me, listen, I never speak about Judeo-Christian tradition because Christianity and Judaism are very, very different. So, do you see this as a primarily political alliance, or is there maybe more shared values that we have with Christians today?
Well, Yoram is a good friend for sure, and he's my colleague at the Emmett Burke Foundation. He's been very helpful for this book. He gave wonderful feedback. He gave a great blurb, and we're close. We actually have a forthcoming piece of legal scholarship in the Harvard Journal of Law and Public Policy that we co-authored that will be coming out later this year. Third co-author as well, but we're very close
And one of the most important conservative writers, even in Israel. Great, great stuff. Yeah. I
for
learned a
sure.
lot of Yoram Chazoni stuff. Yeah.
I think we probably view the question of Judeo Christianity slightly differently. Look, it's not my favorite term in the world, but there's probably a slight difference here between an American and an Israeli mentality. If I had to guess, I am an American. I love the state of Israel. My wife was born in the state of Israel. I am a hardcore Zionist. I'm also an American, and this comes out very much in the book as well. I am born Abraham Lincoln's birthday. I did all the Fourth of July, red, white, and blue parades growing up there. I truly do love this country, and I care quite a bit about this country. And I'm also a lawyer, and I'm a constitutional law guy, and I'm a student of the American founding. And you go back and you look at what some of the American founders had to say about the Jewish people there, whether it's George Washington, John Adams, Alexander Hamilton there. They were oftentimes, not always, but oftentimes over the top philo-Semitic, just genuine admirers of the Jewish people. Alexander Hamilton basically, he has this one quote that I quote at length in an earlier chapter in the book, where he basically says that the proof of God's existence, that the Jewish people are still alive today. John Adams says that the Jews are the most magnificent civilization that's ever existed. Abraham Lincoln, famously in February of 1861, just shortly before the opening shots were fired in South Carolina during the Civil War, speaks of Americans as an almost chosen people using this covenantal language, the pilgrims who sailed on the Mayflower. These were hardcore Puritan Christians. They view themselves as kind of a modern day manifestation of the Jews crossing the Red Sea there. So it
Yeah,
really is
amazing. Just
deeply.
a small anecdote. I once gave students this quote of John Adams that you've been speaking of, And I asked them, so who wrote it? Who said it in history? So people told me this rabbi, that rabbi. No, then I told them it was John Adams, and people was so it's yeah, it's really amazing, amazing quotes. Yeah.
Yeah, so that's all in chapter 4 of the book. And because I kind of grew up in that milieu, I view the question of Judeo-Christianity somewhat differently there. Now, look, are there large theological differences between Judaism and Christianity? Yeah, obviously, and in no way whatsoever will do I ever intend to whitewash those differences. But there are two things also that must be said. One is we literally do have a lot of overlap. So if you actually go and look at a Christian Bible, if you actually open a Christian Holy Bible, one thing will very quickly stand out to you, which is that what the Christians call the New Testament, the Gospel, just based on literal number of pages, it's actually substantially shorter than what they call the Old Testament, what to us is Tanakh. So literally, way more than 50% of their Bible is also our Bible. I mean that's a very very important thing. That seems like a very kind of juvenile, like not maybe not particularly important observation. It strikes me as a very important observation.
Yeah.
I mean, many of my best friends in life have been religious Christians. They can quote again what for them is Old Testament for what us is Tanakh. Whether it's Torah, whether it's Genesis, Leviticus, whether it's Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Kohelet. I mean, you name it. I mean, they can quote it better than most Jews can. So that is very very important that we share a lot in common when it comes to kind of this moral ethical worldview, even if we view the nature of the divine pretty differently in some respects. Not in all respects, but certainly in some very important respects there. The other point though is kind of this point that you're getting at there, which is that it's also in addition to all of what I just said, it also is important for purposes of coalition and kind of realpolitik there. The point is that we are the two religions, Judaism and Christianity, of the Bible. And we are the two religions that are in the crosshairs of the exact same enemies all throughout the world. So again, to me, it's these same three enemies: wokeism, Islamism, and global neoliberalism. And the point is that the enemies of the Jews never actually ultimately interested in coming after the Jews as an end unto itself. It's always a stepping stone towards something greater than that. Karl Marx was quite explicit about this in his essay, his infamously anti-Semitic essay on the Jewish question in the 1840s. He's pretty clear about the fact that the Jews are, he's very anti-Jewish, obviously, but his ultimate goal is the overthrow of all of Western capitalism, all of Western Christendom, the nation state,
And
Christianity
that's
there.
why
He's
he
pretty,
needs to start with the Jews,
yes,
right?
exactly. The
Yeah.
Jews, as the light into the nations, as the original people of the book there, you got to start with them if you then want to eradicate all that flows from them. Christianity obviously comes from Judaism. Any religious Christian worth his or her salt should be able to concede that. It just seems completely obvious. I don't know how anyone can honestly deny that there. So it often starts with the Jews. It starts with the Saturday people, as we would say here in the United States, but it ultimately ends with the Sunday people. From Karl Marx, Hamas itself would be a good example. I mean, Hamas is pretty clear in its founding charter from 1987. Again, they're not just interested in the Jews. They are interested in all of whom they describe as quote unquote infidels, the Iranian regime. They're not just chanting death to Israel, they're chanting death to America because America is this great moral Christian beacon in Western civilization there. So again, we're in this together lockstep. Should we use the term Judeo-Christian? Your mileage may vary. I am personally comfortable with it. It's not my favorite term in the world there, but as a kind of a nice shorthand, I think it works just fine.
And I would say another thing that I think I've heard it from Dennis Prager, who said that there is a difference to say Judeo-Christian in a European Christianity and a Judeo-Christian
Right,
Christianity from the United States that had these long roots in England. So
right.
people like John Selden, and you write it on your book, and all this fascinating period of political Hebrewism, where people like John Selden and Fortescue really read the Bible and used it as a tool, the Hebrew Bible, not the New Testament. And in England, it's very very fascinating. You can read it on your book. So let's talk a little bit about regarding opposition to Israel in the United States. So we are now very familiar with the left-wing woke movement, but who exactly are the Nietzschean right when you're writing about them?
Yeah, so this is a latter chapter in the book. It's about these two particularly pernicious threats to the Jewish people and by extension to all of the Western order, coming from the woke DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion left, and then also the nihilist neo-Nietzschean right. So there's been the rise of this whole influencer cabal on the right. A lot of people with platforms with large megaphones, some of whom have podcasts, some of them have writing platforms there, and they fundamentally reject the Bible. They reject Genesis 1:27. They reject the idea that we are all have genuine moral equal dignity there in favor of, frankly, some neo-pagan ideas that might makes right, that we can tell someone's capacity not by his ideas or his intellect, but by brute strength. A concept, by the way, which is completely rejected out of hand in the book of Psalms and Tehillim, where it very clearly says that you are not judged actually by your strength there. So they're trying to resuscitate a lot of these pre-biblical or anti-biblical ideas, and there's various people that fit into this orbit. There is a particularly influential, for better or for worse, I would say worse, online pseudonymous writer who goes by the name of Bronze Age Pervert, BAP for short. He comes up in this book for some particularly harsh words and some opprobrium there. And you have various people online today, people like the Tate brothers, Andrew Tate and Tristan Tate. They would be a
Yeah,
good example there,
yeah.
not only because not just because they're criminals, which they are, but also because they fetishize the entire idea of brute strength and how a man can be judged by how far he strays his seed and how many women he impregnates. I mean, this is
That's why they're
I
connected to Islam, by the way, I think, in my point.
maybe.
Yeah.
No, that actually makes sense, honestly. You very well might be on something there, but none of this has anything to do, none of it, with biblical ethics. And when you talk about what does it mean to be a conservative, well, look, it depends on the country a little bit here. But again, I'm an American. I'm writing from an American perspective. And in the same chapter in the book, I quote Russell Kirk, who was one of the leaders of kind of the modern capital C conservative capital M movement, writing back in the 1950s there, very clear that one of the foundational tenets, foundational principles of conservatism in America is the idea that there is revelation and that there is the divine and that there is truth. So it seems to me that without the Bible, without this Judeo-Christian order, you're never actually going to arrive at anything remotely resembling conservatism in a cognizable sense of the term there. So the rise of these neo-Nietzscheans and these nihilists on the right are deeply toxic. They're deeply pernicious. They have horrible things to say, not just about Jews, but they're oftentimes outright racist when it comes to talking about black people. They're oftentimes deeply, deeply misogynist when it comes to talking about women. The Tate brothers would be a particularly notable example of that there. This is terrible stuff, but the point for present purposes is that it is anti-biblical and that the Bible itself, yet again, is an antidote to these problems.
So how do you think about figures like, Candace Owens or Tucker Carlson who promote anti-Semitism while speaking in the name of Christianity?
Well, I call them both out in the book. Candace comes in for even harsher treatment.
Right.
Tucker Carlson is a particularly disappointing story. I've been very outspoken about this because I used to be a big fan of Tucker Carlson's. I used to actually watch his Fox News show on a fairly nightly basis. I actually was a former guest on his Fox News show. I've been on a show. I've met Tucker Carlson numerous times. And there was a whole debate here in the United States for years as to whether or not Tucker Carlson is anti-Semitic. And I had these debates with fellow Jews here. I actually usually said that he's not anti-Semitic, that he just happens to not care about the Middle East or whatnot there. It's just not what he focuses on. I obviously was wrong. I very clearly was wrong. The cat has been fully let out of the bag since Tucker Carlson got fired by Fox News and since he went independent there. He does play his hand much closer to the vest. He hides his hand a little bit better than Candace Owens does. I mean, Candace Owens is out there liking tweets promoting the medieval blood libel, the notion that Jews use the blood of Christians to bake their Passover matzah. I mean, a lie, an unmitigated, catastrophic, horrific lie that literally led to the genocide of God knows how many Kedoshim Jews martyred for the Judaism. So Tucker doesn't do that, but he's arguably even more dangerous because he has much more at this point
More
mainstream
popular, right?
more popular, much more mainstream credibility, and because he plays his hand much closer and doesn't give it away as easily there, you have a lot of people who do not harbor any ill will or malice towards the Jews who don't necessarily see it the same way that you or I would see it. They might just say, "Oh, maybe he's just asking questions there,"
Mm.
because he's had so much goodwill and standing for decades and decades there. So Tucker is a massive problem, and I call him out in the book. And look, I'm not a Christian, obviously, so I cannot necessarily I'm not the right person to tell Tucker Carlson or Candace Owens, whether what you are saying in the name of your Lord is appropriate or not. I've certainly had a lot of Christian friends who I've seen both publicly and privately criticize them to no end whatsoever. Jordan Peterson recently called Candace Owens a false prophet, a Pharisee. I mean, had extremely harsh words for her. It seems to me fairly obvious that when Candace Owens gets on social media or her podcast, whatever, and starts saying Christ is king or whatever she is saying there, she's obviously saying it, not necessarily because she believes it. She's obviously and clearly saying it as a way to try to create this wedge. And
Mm.
that's the actual goal
Mhm.
of Candace Owens and Tucker Carlson. That's the actual goal. They will never say it, but that's the actual goal, is to create this wedge between Christians and Jews, to separate the original people of the book, the Jews, from the folks who actually built Western civilization, namely Christendom and Christianity. That is the separation that they are desperately trying to do. And that's exactly the trend that I'm really hoping that my book will start to turn around the tide and start to bring Jews and Christians back together again.
So you have my prayers from Jerusalem that your book is going to be influenced on more American Christians, maybe more than Candace Owens, let's say. So let's talk a little bit about you. So you grew up in a liberal Jewish household, as you said. So how did you go from that to become an Orthodox Jew who knows Torah and Hebrew?
Well, first of all, I do not want to overstate my Hebrew credentials. I am not fluent in Hebrew. But as Rat Hashem, I will be at some point. But my Hebrew is very much a
Next
work in
podcast in
progress.
Hebrew, Josh.
Uh, it might be a struggle. All kidding aside, I really do need to get better at that because my in-laws are much more comfortable in Hebrew than English, and it's really not fair to them. But in any event, I did grow up in a very assimilated home. Now, look, was it completely divorced from Judaism? No. It was a classic North American suburbs assimilated secular Reform Jewish home. So we did some variation of Passover Seders, but if you want a slice of pizza after your Seder, I mean, go for it. I mean, we lit the Hanukkah menorah, without really talking about the actual Hanukkah story and the triumph of the Maccabees and what it actually means there. We went to synagogue, usually, not even always, on like Rosh Hashanah or Yom Kippur. But on the other hand, I definitely did not even know what, for instance, like Sukkot was growing up. I
Yeah.
don't even. I genuinely do not think I had a Shabbat dinner until I was well into my teenage years. All kidding aside,
So we grew up in the same home because I grew up too in a secular family in Israel. So it's very, very similar story. Yeah.
so uh, part of the book is very personal. I tried deliberately in the book to try to seamlessly interweave the personal with the substantive. I didn't want to do like here's a personal chapter and then here's a historical chapter. I wanted to try to weave it all together, and I think it worked. And I talk about this a lot. Is my personal story. So what I basically say is this, Matan. A lot of people who grew up in a religious home here in the States, that would be religious Judaism or Christianity. They derive their political conclusions from their religious principles because ultimately, if you believe in the sovereignty of Malchei Malchim, the King of all kings of God, if you believe in the sovereignty, in his sovereignty, then that is the most important thing in your life by definition. And everything is going to be a secondary or tertiary conclusion that flows from that. So it makes sense that if you grew up as an Orthodox Jew, evangelical Christian, you're going to be a believer. Your political conclusions will flow from that when it comes to abortion, religion, immigration, economics, everything, like all of the above, right? I did basically the opposite. And in the book, I talk about how I was in seventh grade. I was 12 years old when September 11th happened. September 11th, 2001. And I grew up on the Hudson River, 25 miles or so north of New York City. You could see the smoke from the Twin Towers. It was a formative moment in my life, a very real, concrete, visual realization that evil exists and that we live in a world where there is evil. And it logically follows that if there is evil, there must be good. Because how could a God possibly create a world where there is only evil and no good? So once you accept the reality that there is this moral dichotomy, that there is evil and there is good, you're basically a conservative before you know it, because you've already rejected kind of the liberal utopianism, the notion of kind of John Lennon's infamous song "Imagine," kind of, let's all hold hands and kumbaya and just smoke the peace pipe and just eradicate all the borders. And once you move past that, you really are some type of conservative, whether or not you actually embrace the term. And then there was look, there were a lot of steps along the way there. My first trip to Israel, which didn't happen until I was 20 years old, was a very formative moment for me. I remember standing there in Sderot looking out into Gaza. This would be back in 2009, 2010, around there. And I remember thinking, wow, this is the exact same fight that America has been fighting against Al Qaeda. When there's that was a big moment for me, like physically standing there on the outlook, looking out into Gaza. That was a big moment for me. And then kind of just getting deeper in the weeds of conservative philosophy, actually reading up on men like Edmund Burke. I'm a research fellow at the Edmund Burke Foundation. I'm also a former chairman of a debating society at the University of Chicago called the Edmund Burke Society. So I'm a Burke guy in numerous ways. And you read about people like Edmund Burke, Roger Scruton, these great conservative titans, and over and over again, there's this emphasis on this intergenerational passing down of one's inherited way of life and tradition.
Yes,
And at some
I
point,
wrote here a question actually. Is it fair to say that Edmund Burke and Roger Scruton ultimately led you to Orthodox Judaism?
I think in many ways, Burke in particular had a particularly influential role, because he really did make me start to think hard about, okay, I mean, if this idea of intergenerational passing down tradition is so important, what is in my tradition, and what am I doing or what am I not doing there? Heck, I'm a Jew. I come from the oldest continually existing people on this earth. I mean, all the other nations that existed when the Jews existed in the time of the patriarchs, in the time of Abraham Avinu, they're all done. They're all gone. It's only the Jews that have survived from that time. So you want to talk about tradition? I mean, my people have a very long tradition going back to the origins of what today we would call Western civilization, of what today we would call the modern world to an extent there. So one thing leads to another, and I didn't adopt all of the mitzvot overnight. Obviously, it's only fairly recently ish that I really kind of went all in, so to speak, there. But for a very long time, Matan, I intellectually accepted the precepts of Orthodox Judaism, namely that God exists, that revelation of Mount Sinai happened, that the Torah today is the Torah that Moshe Rabbeinu received at Har Sinai. I intellectually accepted all of that years ago. It was just kind of a long process of then matching my day-to-day lifestyle with my intellectual beliefs. I feel wonderful, frankly, and at a deep sense of internal peace that I'm at currently a place where my actions and my life are fully in line. Well, I don't know. I want to say fully in line, but obviously, we're all trying to do better, right?
Yeah, it
But
sounds very good.
right,
Like,
I don't want to overstep here and sound like I'm a great Sadiq. I'm obviously not.
okay.
But I'm saying my day-to-day actions now are at a place where reasonably construed they are in line with my intellectual beliefs there, and that feels genuinely good. I actually sleep quite better at night, frankly, because of it.
Wow, great. So, a question about conservatism and Judaism. Are there any tensions you feel exist between conservatism, Judaism, or other areas where Jewish thought could add something missing to the conservative worldview?
It's a good question. Look, I mean, it's not like, well, first of all, I mean, we're saying the conservative worldview. It's kind of a broad term, right? I
Right,
mean, are we
right.
talking here? I mean, what it means to be conservative in Germany, in the United States, or whatnot there. So there are any number of reasonable things here where I think some people can also deduce different conclusions based on similar first principles. So, not every conservative is going to agree not every Orthodox Jew is going to agree. Anyone who's even remotely familiar with the Talmud could tell you that not every Jew agrees here. I mean, there's literally been books written on the Talmudic debates. There's a whole book on Amazon of just insults from the Talmud, of just Talmudic insults there. And there's a lot in there, actually. There are a lot of amazing insults there.
Yeah.
I'm a little behind, but I started doing a Daf Yomi cycle back in 2020, so I'm behind. I'm very behind, unfortunately, like
Two
3 or 4 months
years you're
behind right now.
finishing in 2 years, right?
Bezrat Hashem, I got to catch
Exactly.
up. I'm quite behind at the moment, but Bezrat Hashem, I'll catch up and finish on time. But I mean, some of these insults are legendary, and there's there's this old joke, at least here in the United States, two Jews, three opinions. I mean, Jews are a very opinion people. So sometimes it's very hard to just define, right, what Judaism or what Jews believe there. That's not always the easiest thing there. Judaism does not have what the Catholic Church has in terms of the catechism. They don't have this central authority from the Vatican in Rome that promulgates and says, here is an
This is the
assertion.
dogma. Yes, right.
Right. That's just not how it works. We have Shulchan Aruch. We have various things that we can cite to, obviously there, but I mean it's inherently a somewhat more fraught activity there. Now, are there some specific things where I would say the mainstream American Republican Party consensus, let's call it that, maybe diverges slightly from the traditional kind of Orthodox Jewish position? Maybe there are some things there. I'm not pretending like it's a perfect matchup. I mean, look, so I'll give you one example. Look, I have been an outspoken opponent of abortion and a pro-life advocate for basically my entire life. I was a founder of the Law Students for Life chapter at the University of Chicago Law School. I have marched for life in sub-zero temperatures in the United States. I care a lot about this. I've spoken at pro-life conferences there. Halakha is definitely anti-abortion. It is not anywhere remotely close to what the American liberals or Democrats would refer to as pro-choice, pro-abortion. It's obviously not that. It is much closer to what American Christians call pro-life. But is the halakhic mainstream opinion exactly the same as the Catholic Church's opinion? No, probably not. Right? I mean, it's slightly different there. So the Catholic Church, for instance, there, and many evangelical Christians, would say absolutely zero exceptions from time of fertilization, from time of conception there. That's not necessarily exactly what halacha says. If there, it goes up to 40 days, give or take, in
Yeah.
the Talmud there. There's a little more wiggle room depending on the circumstances there. Personally speaking, I'm actually on this issue. I'm personally my own moral beliefs are actually closer to the Catholic Church's position. To be honest with you, I've long kind of wished that, kind of selfishly, that halacha would be a little bit closer to my own personal worldview here. But look, these tensions exist everywhere and
This
anywhere.
tension is between Christianity and Judaism, maybe, or halacha. But when I'm talking about tension between conservatism and Judaism, so when I read, for example, Edmund Burke or Roger Scruton, so I can feel that maybe I'm a big fan of Roger Scruton. Really, he's amazing, amazing British writer, and I owe him a lot in all of his books about conservatism that I've read, but maybe there is sometimes a lack of vision or a lack of a certainty in the winning of the good, you know? Can you relate to this? Maybe in Judaism and in the Bible, and as you said earlier, and we talked about the prophecies of Israel, maybe in this sense, I think that Judaism or Jewish Israelis can actually give something to the conservative big conservative maybe in United States or in England, something that the original conservative philosophy is lacking, something like that.
Well, look, again, we're called to be a light unto the nations there, and in terms of kind of providing a spark of godliness into the conservative movement, that would be a wonderful place for Jews to try to fit in here. I mean, everything that the Jew does is supposed to be a sanctification of God's name. I mean, it's right there, frankly, in Tanakh. There's a line in the Kohelet, in the book of Ecclesiastes, that man's whole purpose is sanctifying God, is fulfilling His word and His mitzvot there. So, to the extent that the Jew and I suppose the religious Jew in particular can demonstrate that to his fellow conservatives, and to try to remind conservatives that what does it mean to be conservative if not to glorify and sanctify all that we do in our day-to-day lives, sanctify him and glorify him? That would be a tremendous service, I think, that Jews can and should provide to the conservative movement, both the United States and more broadly speaking. There, generally speaking, when I think about political movements and political theory, there, we talked a little bit earlier in our conversation about the Greeks and the Romans and Strauss and Jerusalem versus Athens and whatnot. There, I think a lot about the Aristotelian concept of telos, of teleology here. And when Aristotle referred to telos, he was referring to, what is the substantive overarching orientation? What is the purpose of this legal edifice, of this political edifice? What are we ultimately trying to get towards here? What is kind of the natural end? It's a question of not just beginnings and means, but a question of ends. So with that in mind, it seems to me like one thing that that Jews can do when it comes to American conservatism and other forms of conservatism would be to remind our fellow conservatives that our ends ultimately are nothing less than the glorification and sanctification of God's name. Something that necessarily includes the political realm. I mean, the notion that God and politics can possibly be separate is completely farcical. I have a full throated opposition to quote unquote separation of church and state in the book's final chapter. This notion that God and politics are separate is a lot of liberal American Jews talk about this as kind of being a tenet of their kind of civic religion. It's actually deeply anti-biblical. There is absolutely no such thing as so-called separation of religion and politics in Torah, in Tanakh. On the contrary, the entire political theory that we can derive from Torah is predicated on the sovereignty of God. Again, we said this earlier, but God standing there at the revelation of Mount Sinai, I shall make you a kingdom of priests, a holy nation there. The entire notion is that you will be a kingdom of priests doing what? Serving me. So God and politics, again, are completely intertwined. And it would seem to me that if Jews want to do a tremendous public service today, they can remind our fellow conservatives of that timeless truth.
So, it's interesting. Melanie Phillips recently wrote a book with a similar message to yours. It's called The Builder's Stone: How Jews and Christians Build the West and Why Only They Can Save It. It's We are promoting Melanie's books as well. So, do you think this marks the beginning of a broader movement that maybe can see Israel as, as an important power for the West?
I hope so. That's obviously part of what I'm trying to accomplish by writing this book. I have not read Melanie's book yet. I did read an excerpt from it and saw it. It definitely looks like in many ways, not exactly the same, obviously, but in many ways quite similar, or at least on a certain level. I mean, look, from my perspective, the more books that are saying something similar, the more podcasts, the more speeches that are saying something similar, the better. Because to take us back full circle to where we began, we are at a civilizational inflection point. We are at a point where a lot of people, I mean, Europe has been going this way for a very long time, but even here in the United States, a lot of people just are forgetting whence we come. Like they're forgetting where we come from and that which actually made this entire nation, this entire civilization great in the first place there. And there's something to be said for prudentially adapting to the modern times and trying to change ad hoc case by case policies to fit new circumstances here. I mean, that's just the good old fashioned virtue of prudence. Okay. There's nothing whatsoever wrong with prudence. I'm a big proponent of prudence, actually. My favorite president in American history, Abraham Lincoln, was a shining beacon of what it means to be a prudential statesman. On the other hand, there's not just prudence, there's also principle. And specifically, when it comes to the level of principle versus prudence, the foremost principle is Bible. The foremost principle is God. The foremost principle are these things that we have so long taken for granted there. And we need people to start waking up to this reality again. And specifically when it comes really to the Jewish people, I think many of our Christian friends, and to be clear, we are so blessed here in the United States to have just tens, maybe hundreds of millions. We have so many amazing, amazing Christian friends of the Jewish people. Frankly, in many ways, the future of U.S.-Israel connections depends more on American Christians than on American Jews. But on the other hand, The polling is what it is, and we do see this younger generation of Christians that, in some ways, is not as all in for the cause of U.S.'s relations, Christian-Jewish relations there. And my hope, above all, is that in reading this book and in trying to re-explore some of what Christians call the Old Testament, Torah, Tanakh, even the Talmud itself, as we discussed a little bit here, that they will see that so much of what Christendom and Christianity has done for the world really does have its origins with the Jewish people and, frankly, in Judaism itself.
Okay, let's finish with two last questions about Israel. So you supported the judicial reform and even debated Ellen Dershowitz on the topic. So given your admiration for Lincoln and his disdain for judicial tyranny, do you think we should still push forward with the reform, even if it risks internal tensions, especially post October 7th, again?
Yes, I think it would be a disaster for Israel to not pursue judicial reform. In fact, I've told numerous members of the Knesset who I've interacted with in the past who have been proponents of this that I've said like pretty point blank, yeah, you guys absolutely should retake this issue up again after the war against not just Hamas but the Houthis and everyone else is sufficiently down again there. I'm not sure when that will be, God willing, sooner rather than later, obviously. But ultimately, Israel cannot exist as a juristocracy. I mean, what kind of a country is such where the 120 member legislature can just debate any issue, no matter how important they're, and then you risk any person just filing a lawsuit without demonstrating what we would call standing that you have a compelling reason to get into court, and then can get a ruling to overturn a policy. It's nuts. I'm telling you, as an American constitutional law guy who keeps his constitution right here on the desk. As someone who clerked on the federal court of appeals, I've spoken at Harvard Law School, Yale Law School. All these, I'm telling you, your guys' system is absolutely bonkers. My admiration for Israel does not extend, frankly, to the Israeli political judicial system, which I think is just completely nonsensical. I think it is very close to an existential issue, frankly, for Israel to kind of sort this out there. And I genuinely hope that they do. Now, it's worth noting that when I debated Alan Dershowitz on this, as you mentioned, it was way back in February 2023. It was kind of in the early running of this debate after Minister Levin and Prime Minister Netanyahu had first kind of gotten the ball rolling on this. Dershowitz, to his credit, did moderate his stance a little bit after our debate. I would like to think, Matan, that my performance had something to do with that.
Okay, great. So, really, last question. On a personal level, how do you balance philosophy, research, writing, and staying engaged with, everyday politics on the radio?
Well, frankly, Mata, my biggest balancing act these days is trying to balance my professional commitments with my wife and my daughter. We had our first daughter three months ago. Her name is Esther, so we just had the holiday of Purim. It's kind of the new young Queen Esther's first holiday, and she's just a total bundle of life. So I finally became a father, and it's the greatest blessing that I could have ever hoped to achieve. But that's really kind of the balance that I'm that in this very moment I am trying to kind of strive to kind of figure out the best way to balance these things. The most important things, of course, serving Hashem, serving God, and then family is obviously the most important there, while still having a vibrant professional life. Look, I am a commentator. I write a weekly syndicated opinion column. It goes in the Los Angeles Times, Newsweek, all these big outlets there. I host two shows. I absolutely have to be on top of the news cycle there. I try to also carve out time to read and think about larger topics as well. I'm not a think tanker. I don't work and live in a think tank. I'm not an academic there, but I try to carve out time the best I can. So, for instance, I think you and I are both big fans of an Israeli named Ronen Shoval at the Argonne Institute. I'm currently reading his wonderful book that came out this past year on the Mosaic socio-political tradition. I'm currently reading that over Shabbat. That's my Shabbat reading at this moment there. So I'm not printing out Wall Street Journal editorials to read over Shabbat. I'm trying to spend my Sabbaths, my Yom Tov, trying to focus on something a little bit more higher and more meaningful. So that's kind of just a snippet of that. But you're right, it is definitely a balancing act day in and day out.
Josh Hammer, thank you very, very much for this very interesting conversation.
It's my absolute pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Thank you very much.